Um, cool. I think we are now recording. So
Great
just
stuff.
first of all, just thank you very much, Diarmaid, for agreeing to do the interview today. You're very welcome.
No problem, no, and cheers for having me on. I'm happy to do it.
No problem, no problem. So just a brief intro for Diarmaid for anyone who's watching or listening. This is Diarmaid Ó'Conoráin. I hope I pronounced that okay. Um, and he is a member of the Irish Freedom Party, and I believe he is an MEP candidate for them in the Dublin area. And also, I believe Diarmaid would probably describe himself as a classical liberal in his thinking. Um, but if there's anything in that I got wrong or you want to add to that, Diarmaid, please feel free.
No, that's pretty accurate. I mean, I think I think a lot of people separate terms like classical liberalism and nationalism, but I think the social contract is essentially nationalism. So I do believe that like classical liberalism is, in an extent, nationalism. So I am a classical liberal. I'm not for big state. I'm not for controlling people's decisions or anything like that, but I do believe in nationalism because, of course, other countries have other cultures, and our nation has its own culture. And the point is, if we import a disproportionate amount of people who value a different culture, then our nation will cease to be the culture that it is. Inevitably, it will be slowly eroded, over time with mass migration. So I do think classical liberalism and nationalism are linked in that, like I said, the social contract is a national contract. It's not an international contract, because if it was, then, in many Muslim countries or other countries, women would have the right to be educated. They would have full positive rights, the same as any citizen. But that's not the case, as we know. So, even if you look at things like gay marriage or abortion, that's not legal all over the world. We had the right as a nation to make our own decision. And I'm not saying I agree or disagree. It doesn't matter. The point is, we had a right to make our own decision and not follow the world. And if we were to try and imagine a democracy of the world, we would be quickly outvoted by people who don't believe in our beliefs. It's not practical at all. Nationalism, which again I believe is classical liberalism, and the social contract are all interlinked. And self-determination hinges on that fact that we don't have influence from other cultures who don't value what we value, essentially.
Interesting. Okay, well, there's a lot there, and I'm sure we'll get to a lot of that during the interview. Very interesting stuff. Um, yes, I see what you mean. Maybe, yeah, well, maybe, and then those terms as well. Like it really hinges on definitions. Like classical liberalism for one person is a different thing for another person, and it's maybe unfortunate that there isn't a more kind of nailed down definition.
Yeah, it's very subjective, unfortunately. It's like idealism. If you can have two idealists who have totally different projections as to where the country should go, and both of them think they're being ideal. But like you said, it's quite subjective. There is no definitive quantitation of what that actually means.
Exactly, for sure, for sure. And maybe just as a general intro to the interview, I just had a few thoughts, and feel free to add to them as well. But where I'm coming from is basically like I see that there's sort of a fear among some people in Ireland that 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 anti immigrant sentiment is on the rise, and the people who do fear that seem to tend to link the Irish Freedom Party with that anti-immigrant sentiment that they're worried about. Um, in full disclosure as well, I probably myself wouldn't agree with the party in terms of immigration, for example, but I'm a massive fan of of having kind of civil discussions and talking things out with people, even if you may disagree with them, and trying to keep it as respectful as possible. And both for, the people involved in the conversation, but also for the wider public, it's of a huge benefit, I think. And then and finally, then is just where I'm coming from is probably I would describe myself as a libertarian, in general, and also I'd probably describe myself as a classical liberal. But as you mentioned, as we were talking about before, there's a wide diversity of opinions within those labels, but I'm sure we'll touch on some of that throughout the interview. So I can start off with a few questions, or unless if you want to add anything to that as well, please feel free.
Yeah, no, just the only thing I'd add is that I think, the mainstream media has done its utmost to make this a personalized issue. And even, when we use the wording anti-immigrant, it makes it personalized. Like I have a problem with these people who I never met and don't know. I don't have a problem with them. And, immigration is a government policy. And in a democracy, I have every right to critique any government policy. But, to call someone, like, I really think there's a big canyon between anti-immigrant and anti-immigration, because anti-immigrant can largely be labeled either, xenophobia or racism. You could, it falls into a lot of dirty categories, let's say. But immigration is a government policy. And when we come to government policies, there are finite realities. There is an amount of housing that we can build each year. And if we bring in more people, which we have done for multiple years in the last 20 years, if we bring in more people than the amount of houses we can build, we're creating a situation where people from other countries are competing with our own people to try accumulate that housing. There is these aren't exact figures, but let me just kind of roughly run you through it, right? In a peak year there, I think it was 2021, 2022, we had, and again, nobody buys a house at 98. But again, the point is, if this is a yearly thing, it's extrapolated out towards all years and it becomes an average. In whatever year it was, we had 50,000 students who did the Leaving Cert and then essentially became adults, right? Now, again, they won't buy a house at 19. Excuse me. But they might do it at 25. And, if that number continues, then it becomes an average. So we have roughly every year between 40 to 50,000 Irish people who enter the housing market. And it's very difficult to find information on this. So I had to resort to things like the number of people becoming adults each year. But so there's roughly 40 to 50,000, right? Ireland's average death rate is about 30 to 32,000 every year. Now, again, not every person vacates a home. Sometimes they leave behind a partner and all. So this isn't an exact science, but it's more a rough picture of scale. Okay, so if we have 40 to 50,000 people, right, and we have roughly 30,000 people who die every year, and we build between, which we have been since I think 2006, an average between 20 to 30,000 houses a year, then we can see that we don't have much excess there. Right now, there's also a report that's come out that is estimated to be at least 250,000 up to 290,000 what they call hidden homeless. These are people living with family, living with friends, couch surfers, people who can't find a house or can't afford a house. So Ireland is in a hole. We actually need to catch up on housing. We're not at a level state where we can start bringing in an influx of people. But like I said, even with the EU Migration Pact, with this minimum requirement now of 30,000 asylum seekers, when we look at the fact that last year we built 32,000 homes and people can't stay in hotels forever, we understand that this is a mathematical equation that just does not work out. And the point is, unfortunately, there are a lot of countries which are far larger land masses and far larger populations who want to come to Ireland. And we are a small nation, we're a small population, we produce a small amount of housing, and we simply cannot cope with the perpetual external demand, which is, I suppose, the best way to put it, because it is, every year more and more people want to come here and we cannot house our own.
We get you. And I definitely agree with the fact that we've a lot of issues in the housing sector and building houses, and there's a lot of things there. But it's interesting that why the focus on immigration as because I could see a lot of problems, for example, that if you've like government inefficiencies and sort of regulation that is like slowing down the building of houses and making rents very unaffordable, etc., etc. Why why would you why the focus on immigration as opposed to things like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, we do, like, let me put it in my mind. There are three focuses, right? The first one is um, essentially external investment funds, right? And these are like I think it's Iris Regs. I can't quite remember the name. They are Ireland's biggest private landlord, right? And this is purely about a safe hedge against inflation. People put their money into housing so that their money, housing always goes up in value, so that their idle savings essentially are hedged against inflation. But they've consumed a massive amount of housing in Ireland, and the point is, none of them want to sell. They want to hold on to it for 10 or 15 years until the price goes up, and for that 10 or 15 years they will rent. So now we have far more properties available for rent than we do for buy, and we are becoming a renting population. Our percentage of home ownership is dropping rapidly, and we used to have one of the best in Europe at this. So that's a major function. I don't believe foreign investment funds should be able to snap up what I would deem one of the most essential basic human needs and then wield it over a population who cannot. I mean, the average house price in Dublin is €500,000 now. And an article came out, it was maybe a couple of weeks or a couple of months ago, where it said a couple made up of a Garda and a nurse can no longer afford a mortgage in Dublin. Now, these are state jobs. These are kind of what we used to deem a job for life. You are, as far as a bank looks at you or a mortgage holder or whatever, you are a secure bet. But they can't afford that anymore. It's partially due to foreign investment funds snapping up the supply, and it is partially due to a massive external demand, which, like I said, I ran the figures once, and roughly, if you say 50,000 people become adults a year, we have 30,000 deaths a year, and we're building between 20 to 30,000 homes a year, then roughly Ireland can handle its own demand. It's what I would call organic demand. It's when we start having a net immigration of 30,000 people plus, and I think it was 2022 or 2023, 250,000 people came here. And we built 27,000 houses, I think, that year. That's just completely out of the ballpark in terms of what's sustainable. And the third thing I'd add in is that there is external demand and there is a problem with private investment that, I would somewhat consider myself a libertarian myself. But when I see things like how the market develops, and you realize that all the people who have money want to hedge that money against the rise of inflation by investing in housing, and you start to think to yourself, maybe there should be a law against this because it's affecting a lot of people. And it's not very libertarian, but it is in the fashion of the social contract and negative rights. In that, the whole idea of a negative right is that neither of us are allowed to do a thing, but it's because it affects both of us negatively. Like I can have fridge, but I'm not allowed to assault you. You're not allowed to rob from me. Things like this. So negative rights are, when well thought out, in my opinion, and very productive to civilization and society. But with the European Union, sorry to come back to this, with the European Union, we essentially have an untrammeled right of freedom of movement. Right now, that's fine because, in one aspect, it's fine because genuine workers, Ireland actually has a problem getting immigration right now because genuine skilled workers aren't idiots. And they look at the housing market, they look at the price, they look at the cost of living, and they say, do you know what, maybe I'll go to Canada or Australia. Like Ireland isn't a good bet right now. But the problem with EU freedom of movement is that if we lose essentially the autonomy over who we hand citizenship to. Because if Germany hands out 30,000 citizenships, or France, or anyone else, Sweden, they are now part of EU freedom of movement as EU citizens, and they can come to Ireland. And again, unfortunately, there is no stipulation in this legislation that says, well, look, if Ireland has a housing crisis, the freedom of movement is on pause. They still have a right to come here, and more people coming here essentially will do nothing but bury us in a further hole of housing. Like, we cannot catch up, let alone keep up at this rate. I'm sorry if I went on a tangent.
No, it's interesting. It's interesting. Um, okay, so maybe so hypothetically, imagine there wasn't a housing issue for some reason. Hopefully one day that will be the case.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, uh, if there was no issue, how with that, would it be okay to have that level of immigration, do you think?
Well, you see, let me put it this way, and I often use this argument with people who say, listen, Ireland had immigration for years and nobody said anything. Nobody said anything. What we're experiencing now is mass immigration, right? And the difference is, when you have regular immigration, you get integration, right? People come here and they integrate into our society. That's a big difference. There's very little talk anymore about integration. All the talk is about multiculturalism. Right. And this is
Hmm.
because of mass immigration. When people flood here in so many thousands of people, they can find other people from their home culture. And of course, it is favorable to them to associate with that. And so, where you could maybe in second generation immigrants, you had like total immigration. You had immigrants playing Ga and speaking Irish and all. Now we don't have that. Now they want mosques. Or like they stay in their own groups. And you see, we've had the first report of it was maybe a couple of years ago now, the first report of female genital mutilation in Ireland, which is an African custom, and again, that's not integration, and nobody denies that immigration holds a value in terms of you can certainly fill labor shortages, etc. It holds a value to an economy, but there are, to be honest with you, there are six arguments to this. One of the other arguments is right in terms of the European Union and Europe as a whole. Ireland has actually one of the worst biodiversity records. Right, we are destroying our natural habitat, and the European Union actually has multiple open cases against us for non-compliance. So, a country has a carrying capacity. You know, it has a certain amount of people, and then it has the land that it needs to produce the food for that people. If you double the population, you simply will not have land to be sustainable and provide your own food at that point. Now you are reliant, and reliant is a very dangerous situation, because anything like the Ukraine war can pop off, and all of a sudden the supply chains are interrupted. In the Irish Freedom Party, one of the things we look for is basically self-sustainability in as much as possible, whether that be food production or energy production or whatever it may be. So again, if we concrete over the whole of Ireland to accept a limitless amount of immigration, and actually England is a very good example of this. England's biodiversity, as far as I know, is below 50% right now. I think the UN recommends between 75 to 80% as sustainable. Essentially, if England existed on its own right now, without the rest of the ecosphere of the world, there's no guarantee they would be surviving. Everyone knows the Amazon forest is very important. It sucks up a lot of the carbon and all that. So if England existed isolated, they have essentially destroyed their country through, you wouldn't call it specifically mass immigration, but mass immigration warrants further industrialization, further encroachment on the natural habitat, further space used for housing. It takes up and you are like, the ecosystem is keeping us alive. We can't just concrete over everything and expect everything to keep working. So would I, again, like I said, theoretically, hypothetically, I don't have a problem with immigration, and neither does the Irish Freedom Party. But we understand finite limits, and we do understand that the methods that have been put in motion are unsustainable. If we are going to talk about things like climate refugees and the EU Migration Pact of 30,000 asylum seekers a year, this is unsustainable for Ireland. And there isn't really, if for anyone who can consider things abstractly and look a few years down the line, there isn't really an argument that this will inevitably lead to the destruction of Ireland, in different ways, like not just quality of living, and like even in terms of cultural. Because, if you bring in too many people too fast who don't believe what you believe, but you give them a right to vote, at that point, I do believe you are undermining your own self-determination. Like if you brought 4 million Westerners to a Middle Eastern country who believe in equality, you're going to have a change in demographic in that country where women aren't allowed to be educated. It's going to totally affect their beliefs, and the same is true in reverse.
And the allowed to vote thing, that's interesting. Like, so I'm guessing I'm not 100% sure on this, but like asylum seekers, I'm guessing don't immediately get the right to vote when they come here, or like a French national who moves to Ireland for economic reasons, they can't immediately vote, I'm guessing.
It's very nuanced. I believe in terms of the three different tiers that exist, like local election, general election, European election, a lot of countries actually facilitate that you can vote in your home country. So there could be, let's say, French people here who go to the embassy and they vote in their national election or their MEP elections. But with local elections, the funny thing is, I believe for the general election and the European election, you have to be an Irish citizen, or at least a European citizen with a status to remain here. For the local elections, you just have to be a resident. You don't have to be a full citizen. Now, I'm not sure if that actually qualifies asylum seekers, because technically their claim is still in lieu, and they may or may not have been granted status to remain. If they have been granted status to remain, then they are technically a resident and they have the right to vote. But the system in Ireland is working so slowly now that I'm sure a lot of the asylum seekers don't actually have the right to vote, but migrants certainly do. Again, it's not citizenship; it's just anyone resident.
You're saying so it's the national, constitutional and national, they don't, but then local, do you think they do?
Local, as far as I know, any resident can vote, and we've seen multiple people canvass on this about informing migrants, etc., who may not have citizenship, and your background may not be Irish either, but you are entitled to vote in the local elections. I don't think it extends further than that, though.
Getcha. Okay, no, that's interesting. I must look that up. Yeah, that's yeah, okay, cool. Um, and when you were talking there, what came to my mind was that uh like I'm pretty sure Ireland is one of the least like dense countries. Like if you look at say Netherlands, for example, which is 16 million or something, and they're like they're tiny. I don't know how, I think they're a third or maybe even less the size of us. Um, but they, how would you view a country like that that's way more densely populated?
Well, again, I think, you only need to look at England. You only need to look at India or China or, places where their rivers are polluted, and in China, I don't mean to be offensive, but in China, they're basically eating everything because, essentially they literally, they have too large of a population to have the agricultural land required to sustain that population. So they eat uncommon things. And it's the same with a lot of countries like, I think it's like 60% of the world actually eats insects. It's kind of just the West that doesn't, strangely enough. But essentially, with places like Denmark, again, Denmark is, we've got to essentially look, right? We can look and say, okay, we're not as tightly packed as India. We can take more people. But India is struggling. In truth, China is struggling. Like, they import a lot of food, they import a lot of water, and this kind of reliance, again, in the event of any international event like the Ukraine war or whatever, you put your people at severe risk when you need to import your water or food. Like, these are very basic requirements. And then there's the other thing of, like I said, the ecosystem and the biodiversity, and then the standard of living too. I mean, there's a lot of people in Hong Kong, but they live stacked on top of each other like 60 stories high. You know, I think a lot of people in Ireland, like, we suffered under foreign tenancy, etc., so long that, this is why home ownership in Ireland originally was much higher than elsewhere, because we got this idea in our head all of a sudden. I want a house, like, and I don't want it to be, I don't want semi-detached. Like, I'd like to have four walls of a house, maybe a front and a back garden, and maybe I could put two cars in the drive and not just one, like.
Very
Um,
American, yeah. Yeah.
yeah, but it's just, it's like when people used to say we had a higher population during the famine than we do now. And I say, yeah, that's true. But people did not live the same way at all. You could see 9 people living in a little cottage, like, and now, like, everyone loosely aspires to own their own home. And again, to have a little bit of, I don't want to be on the 17th block and my kids have to go down to the communal playground. It'd be nice to have a set of swings out in my own back garden for my kids. So again, it comes down to a lot of people. The density issue comes down to you can have more people in the same space, but you will sacrifice standard of living. And again, like I said, the more people you put in the same space, the more demand you put on the agricultural land and everything else that's required to support that, even the land for people to work, which again, like I said, in England, which was responsible for the industrialization, because people need to be employed. So eventually, I think you eat into your own habitat, and it's arguable where that line is. You know, that's a very circumstantial thing for each country with its own resources, its own land mass, its own climate, even with regard to growing food. It's very, there are a lot of moving parts in that issue.
Yeah.
But again, I just think, like, and another thing, I just come back to this for a second, because in terms of, we seem to have this idea, like, it's been an old idea, maybe 100, maybe even 300 years now. But the economic model we have essentially warrants a pyramid population. We need a larger working force at the bottom to pay for the pensioners at the top. Now, Ireland has an aging demographic, and this is the problem. And this is half the reason that the establishment used to justify immigration, because they say, well, we need workers to pay for our pensions, and Irish people aren't having kids. But they're not having kids because they can't afford to have kids. But back to the point, that model of, a larger base than you have at the top is a model essentially that requires inevitable growth, because if you have that larger base that supports that top, eventually that base gets to the top, and you need a larger base and a larger base to perpetually support the growing base or top. So that is, like I said, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of food security, in terms of energy security, that is putting us on that economic model puts us on an inevitable path to destroying our habitat, in my opinion, because it constantly requires population growth, and that's not a. I don't think it's a controversial issue to say that the human population cannot continue to expand forever while being sustainable. I don't think that's controversial.
Well, yeah, unless we get to Elon gets to Mars and we we
Yeah,
start on that
yeah.
route, yeah,
Then we have a new conversation.
yeah, maybe that'll be a bit different. Um, Interesting. Okay. So yeah, because I'm thinking like somewhere like England, like you said England a few times, that like they've got so many. I know we've got Dublin, obviously the big city, and it's dense and, well, relatively dense
Mm.
for Ireland. Cork is probably quite dense, and Galway and such. But like there's so much area, you know, seems like there's plenty of space to have like another big number of cities around the country if, which would only be the case if, we had the population to sort of necessitate that sort of development.
Mm.
Um, but then, and I was also thinking of, so, like the United States in the 1800s, that had, as far as I'm aware, pretty much open immigration. I think if you got that, I mean, it was treacherous to get there, but if you got there, safe enough, you got on with it, and you
Yeah.
were assimilated there. Um, do you think was that a bad policy for them back then, or what do you think of that sort of time in America?
Well, that's very, I suppose, again, a lot of things kind of come from the perspective you're looking at them, and I'm sure if you not asked the Native Americans, they don't think that was a good period in their history. Um, but if you look at it from, I suppose, the Western perspective, it was a new landmass, and they were looking not only to populate it, but for a workforce. So like you said, they essentially, and again, logistics have changed a lot. Technology and methods of transport have changed a lot. And at the time, there weren't, and I'm not just picking on Africa here, I'm just saying, at the time, there weren't ships leaving Africa to go to America, but there were ships leaving Europe. So I believe their open policy was largely based on the fact that they kind of knew they were getting people from educated countries. The people who were coming over were probably going to be builders, etc. And the thing is, we know with Ireland's history that we suffered from brain drain during the famine and all. We lost a lot of good people.
Mm.
I don't think the United States cared about that. They figured Europe has lots of good people. We're not concerned with that at all. When it comes to countries like Africa and that, there are certain countries like, especially Zimbabwe, I often bring it up because there's so few people gainfully employed in Zimbabwe, that if we actually take a doctor or a nurse from Zimbabwe, we're not helping them at all. We're helping ourselves. Zimbabwe has a population of about 18 million people, and I think gainfully employed there's maybe about 1 million people. So
Mm.
if we take their engineers or doctors, we're not helping, any more than the United States at the time when you were speaking about, they weren't helping us, they were helping themselves. They didn't care if Ireland lost its brightest minds. They just wanted to have a competent workforce now. So in ways it's comparable because, not every country develops at the same pace. And again, when you analyze some of them in terms of what is really going on there, you realize that, like, look, we're not doing any favors by taking their skilled people. And if we take their unskilled people, well, what's the point of that? We're not helping ourselves either. We're just importing cheap labor that suppresses upward pressure on wages, which is majorly needed in Ireland because the earning power has diverted from the cost of living, specifically in terms of housing, so much that unions have let a lot of Irish workers down. And this is, again, it's due to excess labor. Like, a lot of Irish nurses and doctors have left here because they can't afford housing, and we've got a lot of Filipino or Indian nurses, and they're good people. They're fine at their job. It's nothing to do with that. But the point is, they're prepared to come here for a few years and live together, which slims down the rent. They send money home and then they go home, and that's fine. But again, it puts like 6 foreign people competing against 2 Irish people for a home, and they have to move out of Dublin because they're just not earning. And they would, if there was a limited supply of doctors and nurses, they would have upward pressure on wages. They could say, well, listen, no, we're not taking 50, we need 55 grand a year. But when you bring in replacements willing to work for the money, because the purchasing power parity in their nations is, the canyon between it means essentially that Irish people on Irish wages cannot afford an Irish living, but foreign people on Irish wages can group together to afford an Irish living and still afford to send money home. It is actually still financially beneficial for them. And again, in purchasing power parity, if you sent €250 to Thailand, it's quite a lot of money. €250 isn't €250 everywhere. It's not half a week's wages to everyone, just to a lot of people in a lot of countries, rather. It's quite a bit of money, so that is a large part of what's happening as well. So again, like nobody denies that you can't, any country that tries to be isolationist and tries to just shut off immigration and close the borders completely, like you're good luck with that. I don't think you're going to have much success with that.
So
But in the
you're not for so you're for some immigration, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Irish, like I said, a lot of this, and it is, again, like I said, there are multiple moving parts here, and some of it is down to simple supply and demand of housing. Some of it is down to surplus labour requirements, because what the Irish Freedom Party want is somewhat an Australian-style points-based immigration system. Because here's the thing. If Ireland needs 35,000 nurses, and we have 40,000 nurses, importing 5,000 more nurses doesn't help us. And this is why we need, like a points-based system isn't really a consistent thing. It's more of a moving mechanism that decides, okay, this year we need mechanics, this year we need engineers, and you take in what you need, but you don't import competing labor for your own people, because that's just not productive. As much as I understand, and everybody wants to be empathetic, that people are just seeking better lives, there is a moral clause here that says we cannot give you a better life at the expense of our own people. And this is where, like I said, labour surplus and labour demand needs to be very balanced. And again, even the numbers coming in needs to be measured against the housing we can create, the schools we can create, the amount of hospitals we can create, because you can't just bring 500,000 people here and think that the hospitals we have can handle that. It can't. It's being proven.
Gotcha. Okay. Interesting. Maybe trying to see what we can get out. I know we're eating through the time. What about?
Sorry, that's me waffling. Sorry.
No, it's good.
I'll try condense answers.
No, all good, all good. What? So okay. The Dublin riots. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, look, first and foremost, both the party and myself have made it clear multiple times that this is not the way to get things done. It's just not. But I understand, and I had a conversation with this with someone a while ago. I understand. You see, I was there very close to the beginning of the East Wall protest, right? And East Wall created quite a bit of momentum and quite a bit of attention. And what this did was it revealed the establishment's hand in that they showed themselves, no, you don't get a veto, you're all racist. There was no self-determination or representation. It was met with essentially pure discrediting and abuse. This went on for a while, and more asylum centres were opened where people didn't want them, and the government proved they just don't care what you want. They just don't care at all. They hold allegiance to international obligations, which again, the Geneva Convention holds no stipulation that if a country has a housing crisis, then it has a right to reject people. It's a flawed law that just says if someone comes and says they claim asylum, you have to process their claim. You don't have to grant it, but you have to process. And if 50,000 people arrive here, you've overloaded the system to the point where the processing takes years. So they're now housed in Ireland for years before that. But this was all going on, and it was mounting and mounting. And you had people like Aidan O'Riordan who were asked, why don't you go down and speak with locals and hear their concerns? And he said, why would I? The arrogance and complete dismissal that came from the government was a shock to a lot of people, I think, to be honest. I think a lot of people thought, if we mobilise and we show them, they'll listen. They didn't. And people have been warning about these things. And in the likes of the East Wall Asylum Centre, I believe the Gardaí have been there maybe 4 or 5 times. There were American tourists robbed and all. Like, some of these people are committing crimes. In Killarney, there were stabbings. In City West, there were riots. People know. I believe in Cork, maybe 2 years ago, there was a prostitution ring being run out of one of the direct provision centres. So people know that these aren't all innocent people fleeing. Our system is being gamed. And then I think when it came out that a guy who had been subject to a deportation order and it wasn't served had then, you know, indiscriminately stabbed children in Parnell Street, I think people just lost the plot. It was one thing in East Wall to know, like, I don't think we're getting good people in here, and then they rob people and they're out fighting on the street and all. You're like, look, we told you. When a little child suffers for somebody else's bad decision, I think people lose the plot.
Mm.
I think, like there was the murder of Ashling Murphy. There's been a lot of things here. There was a Japanese guy murdered here by another immigrant. Like, there was a lot of stuff going on, but I think, when you go after, like, when children are affected by things, like, especially in something, a stabbing is quite a violent crime, and especially when it's so indiscriminate that you just pick children out of a crowd. You were walking down the street and you
Mm.
just decided, here we go. I think people just lost the plot, to be honest. And I think they were like, there's an element of, like, I told you so for the last 18 months or 2 years. And then literally what you might call the worst imaginable thing happens, you know. And I think in that moment, a lot of people who understand that this is not the way things get done, this is not how you'll actually affect change, I think they just lost it. I think they just didn't care anymore. They were like, you know what? Like, if this is what it is, then I'm happy to just burn it all down. If this is where we're
Yeah.
headed, like, if this is all we value as a society, then I don't care anymore. Now
Here's
I wasn't in there. I don't condone arson. I don't. Myself and the party have said that this is not the way. We're running in elections because we believe this is the way to get things done. You
right.
know, you partake in democracy. You try to change opinions and all. This is how we do things. But like I said, I certainly understand. You know, to some extent at least. Put it that way.
Yeah, you can
So as
see
I said,
why they're a bit you can understand where they're coming from, but you are saying you
yeah,
disavow or dis
that's it.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I certainly wouldn't condone it. I certainly wouldn't encourage it, but I don't feel at liberty to just dismiss people's anger either, because I know what's been going on.
I get you. And and I'm guessing you're not saying, like, the fact that that person obviously committed the horrible crime, the stabbing, like, that has nothing to do with their immigrant status, or do you think there is, or that.
No, no, it's not like that's a good question, right? Because what you're essentially asking me is, do I believe an immigrant is more likely to commit a violent crime? No, I don't. But what we do know is that this guy came here. He hadn't worked for most of his time here. He was subject to a deportation order, as far as I'm concerned. As far as I know. And so the the end point becomes, this was preventable to an extent, because if we had an Australian point, this guy isn't an engineer. He's not a doctor. Doctors don't do things like this, and neither do engineers. People like you and me don't do things like this. So if we had a points-based immigration system that only brought in skilled labor, I think that's why people got so crazy, is because it could have been prevented. Like the Ashling Murphy murder could have been prevented. We have nobody. It would be foolish to act like Ireland is a place of no crime. And we don't have our own criminals, and we don't have our own deviants and demons among the population who just need to be put in a cage. But again, they're really, it's a solid argument enough to say that, like, look, this was preventable. We don't need to, unfortunately, with the Geneva Convention, is that A part of claiming asylum might be that your home state has criminalized you, whether it be for opposition or whatever it might be. So a criminal record does not disqualify you from seeking asylum, especially if you've just torn up your passport beforehand. So we don't know, and I've said this to be, and this is a bit of a fear mongering thing to say, but the point is, can anyone show me where the proof that it's not happening, right? And what I'm saying is, Fidel Castro opened the Cuban prisons and told them, go to America. We have no proof that other countries aren't just saying, look, go seek asylum in Europe. We don't fucking need to be paying to house you in prisons and all. And again, when you look at like a lot of the stuff like direct provision, prostitution rings, like Killarney stabbings, the riots in City West, all, you start to realize like these guys aren't engineers and doctors because they don't act like that. It's very simple, unfortunately. Like there are behavioral patterns that are attributable to certain groups of society.
And like, would it be right in saying that would you be okay with some asylum seekers? It's just the amount is sort of the issue at the moment.
Absolutely. The amount and the cost. I mean, I think, and I've said this to someone else recently when I was being interviewed, and I said, I believe Irish people, for the most part, when the Ukraine war popped off, Irish people, they didn't have a problem. Even though there's been, and this is the other thing as well, uh, a lot of people say, oh, you blame immigrants on the housing crisis. No, I don't. We've had a housing crisis for 2 decades, and that was well before mass immigration started. The unfortunate thing was we had a government who was so stupid to be in the knowledge that we had a housing crisis and still invite mass immigration, which just makes no sense. But so again, back with the Ukraine war, it's a genuine war. The country was invaded. Nobody understands this like Irish people. I think, even I don't know if I call myself hardline, but I'm not soft line. Even people like myself were like, no, we should help. We should try, do anything we can to help. And Ukrainians were being put in hotels and all, and people said, fine. Their country is being bombed by a foreign nuclear power. Like, fine. This is what the Geneva Convention is actually about. The problem is that we have asylum seekers from Nigeria, from Algeria, from the United States of America, from a list of safe countries. We even have now. This is an isolated incident, and it's a graphic incident. It should not be taken as the norm, but it is a perfect example of what is happening in Ireland. And one is that we had this guy come from a Muslim country, and initially he said, "I'm a Christian." And I'm being persecuted in this Muslim country. Now, was whatever happened with the investigation, that claim was refused. They said, like, no, we don't believe that's true. He appealed the claim. That's the problem too. People are in direct provision for 10 years, appealing and appealing and appealing. He appealed the claim, and he said, okay, I'm a homosexual in a Muslim country, and I'm being persecuted. While that claim was being processed, he was found guilty of raping an Irish woman. He claimed he was homosexual. So, this is how much, unfortunately, I believe the word has gotten out about Ireland's asylum system. It's like, listen, it's an easy game. You can get in there, you can get free housing. Just tell them you're being persecuted.
I guess your opinion, yeah, is like you think it's like very lax and not being properly checked sort of thing and taken
Yeah,
advantage
I
of.
think like yeah, it's definitely being manipulated and exploited. And then like one more thing I'd add is that again, it depends on why you're claiming asylum. Like Ukraine is at war. There aren't many countries at war. I do believe there are a lot of suspicious. They're going to start pushing now for climate refugees, and the problem is climate refugees is going to open Ireland essentially to again an unsustainable amount of people. I seen a report that said one of our ministers was told that Ukrainians will soon be a side issue. There are expected to be at least or up to 1 billion people expected to need to leave Africa due to climate issues. Now, we don't need to actually get into the climate debate at all. All we need to say is, like, how many of these 1 billion people is Ireland expected to take? And is this feasible or sustainable at all? Because to a large extent, there's no point, as I often said, like, again, with brain drain and taking people's, what I call human resources from a nation, and even down to the fact of, like, if Africa or whatever country it may be is having problems, taking 25,000 people out of that country and helping them isn't solving the problem. You haven't addressed the root cause, and the country is still in turmoil. There is no point in this. All you've done is save a fraction of the people. So I actually believe more in foreign aid than I believe in economic immigration. Put it that way, because, like I said, we're taking their skilled people, and I'd rather we invest in their home country, address the sources of the problem at the root of the cause, and try to fix it for the whole population. Rather than, like I said, you bring 25,000 people to Ireland and they get a better life, but, like, whatever country it may be is still on its knees. You've patted yourself on the back and thought you've helped, but you haven't. Like, in 10 years, that country may be still in turmoil and still suffering from mass emigration, which, again, Ireland suffered under. And, I wouldn't like to facilitate it. People, unfortunately, countries often lose their best through mass immigration, because these are the people who are motivated, these are the people who are clever, they can quantify the situations around them, and they realize there are better circumstances elsewhere. So it's dysgenic for a country to have mass emigration, sorry, not immigration.
And do you think and imagine a case where, like, I don't know, a country can be very corrupt, or very, like, it could be, I don't know, like North Korea or some, dictatorship, etc., where it's almost impossible to, I don't know, for a person to do something, like if you kept them there, you're essentially like condemning them to, I don't know, a terrible
Yeah.
life, death sort of thing. Um, it seemed, I don't know, like I'd be relatively okay with, yeah, like trying to help out, and
No,
obviously the case of the numbers are important. But in principle,
yeah.
welcome sort of thing.
No, and that's what I've said to people as well. People have said that, oh, you and I disagree on asylum. I said, listen, we don't disagree in principle. We disagree in the method. I believe we should help. It's just, I don't believe how we're trying to help is actually fixing it. But you're right in that, like, because it's a complex situation. There's that other argument you kind of brought up, which is that I won't pick a country or a group. Let's say you were a very forward thinker. You were Galileo in the time of the church, let's say, and you can't reach your full potential in the country you're in because your country has a backwards dogma, and you think to yourself, like, I could do a bit better than this. I maybe should do a bit better. I should maybe leave, There's a twofold argument here. The first part is correct, but the second part says, if for example, all the women who want equal rights in countries where they don't have them flee to the West, well, then, will that country ever see a social justice movement that eventually brings about equal rights for the women? Like, you have to an extent, you have to fight for what you want. And like I said, if all the people who oppose tyranny flee tyranny, then in a sense, you are facilitating the tyranny, because all the people who would have fought it have lost. And now the tyranny is ruling over everyone who is not intellectually capable, morally capable, or does not have the willpower to fight it. If everyone who was unhappy with English occupation of Ireland left, Ireland would not be free. So there is, and it's a cruel argument, because you kind of say to people, well, you should stay at home and fight it, and that's not very empathetic. It's not very understanding. But unfortunately, it is how history works. Like the age of the Enlightenment, like it came with overthrowing kings, etc. Nobody just gave it to them because they had nice ideas and because they were right. Even when sometimes you're right, people aren't going to give it to you. So you essentially come down to two different arguments, where Are we going to facilitate helping a very small minority of people living under a bad regime or tyranny, or do we consider ourselves the world police to go in and change their country, which I certainly don't. I don't think America has any right doing things like that, or NATO, or anyone like that. Or do we let them get to their own conclusions at their own pace? I believe this is why I was kind of looking forward to this interview with Libertarian Ireland, because I like philosophy a lot, and one of the things I'm big on is I don't really believe in moral relativism. I believe in categorical imperatives. I believe if a thing is right, it's right. But I'm a nationalist. So at the same point, I don't believe Europe has the right to go into the Middle East and say, listen, you're wrong and you're going to live by these rules. Moral relativism says they can live by nationalism says they can live by their own rules. Moral relativism would say they're right too. I don't believe they're right. I believe everyone should have equality. There shouldn't be people who aren't, there shouldn't be such a strict religious dogma. People can be atheists if they want. People can be gay if they want. There shouldn't be this overarching single theory that rules everybody's lives. But at the same time, we are not entitled to, or nor are we required to impose this on other people. So to an extent, I look at a lot of these countries and say they'll get there. In time, their women will do what women in America and women in England and women in Ireland did, and they'll say, "What taking this shit anymore?" But it is very much a natural progression, I think. At the same time, too, so it's again, it's very difficult to quantify like where and when we should interfere, and again to how much, like whether our helping is actually facilitation on the other end, because
I gotcha.
like I said, we took in the rebels, so now that the tyrant has nobody to worry about to an extent, so it's very, like I said, there's a lot of moving parts in so many of these issues that it really requires, like you said, just a good open conversation and an honest conversation.
Interesting. Yeah, no, that's a good point because I do would generally agree that yes, don't shirk responsibility, don't shirk a fight, try to I
Yeah,
do genuinely believe that a single person can do more than they think. Um,
100%.
but but it doesn't for some reason it still doesn't square with me with the asylum thing. But I'll have to think about it more for sure. And but it's a very interesting point though. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and like I said, just the last thing of that is that, like I said, the Irish Freedom Party is not against asylum. What we want, the Geneva Convention is essentially a legal open door that says once you come here and say you claim asylum, we have to deal with you. What we want is that essentially Ireland gets to make its own decisions. In which case, I'm sure we would have looked at the war in Ukraine and said, we're going to help. And we'd have looked at people coming from Nigeria and been like, "What are you talking? You're one of you're one of the three biggest economies in Africa. Why are you coming here? Like the only people ahead of you are Egypt and South Africa. Like, why are you coming here? Unless you're Edward Snowden and you have some political threat against your life or whatever. You know what I mean? There's very few reasons for people to come from safe countries. And if they have a legitimate reason, it's usually easy enough to back up. And again, if you have a legitimate reason, you would generally want your documents so that you could clarify this,
Mm.
um, and prove it. You wouldn't destroy your documents so it made your claim all the harder to prove. That is, that's not an act of good faith.
I gotcha. I gotcha. I'm conscious. I'm keeping you. I don't want to keep you over time here. Do you
No,
have
but
time for
no,
one more question?
100%, yeah, absolutely.
I might just share. This one is the tweet one. Just to,
Right, yeah, yeah.
if that's okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think I can just share my screen.
Green chair, yeah.
So I had a quick look at their Twitter, and this one just stood out to me. I could see um why. So I might just read it out just in case anyone's listening.
Yeah.
So it says in the North Side people at the moment, a Nigerian sorry, there's a picture of a newspaper cutting, and the newspaper is called the Northside People. It says a Nigerian man who wants to take an Irish person's spot in Irish politics. Not acceptable. Pick another job or be a candidate in Nigeria. Given you felt compelled to leave, they must need it. And I think it's Councillor Mulhuddert in Blanchardstown.
Yeah, it's Fianna Fáil for the local election councils. Yeah.
So yeah, what I mean that tinges me as a bit like that sounds quite I don't know, racist, or how would you describe that?
Well, I'm glad you asked. Right. So the first point here is, and I like to often debunk this as the first point. Right. There is nothing race related about it. If we could have a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Russian guy trying to run in the local elections in Ireland, and I would be equally against it. Right? It is not to do with race. It is to do with the fact that they are not Irish. They're not Irish, and they do not have Irish ancestry. So, I don't think, like, there is, again, the social contract essentially is an agreement between the representatives and the represented. Right. And again, like I said, it's a national agreement. So I don't believe Irish self-determination, and you'll have to kind of bear with me here till I extrapolate this a little bit. Irish self-determination cannot be exercised by people who aren't Irish. If you literally were born and have two Nigerian parents and you come from Nigeria or China or Russia or Brazil or France, you aren't Irish. You're French. You're Chinese, whatever it may be. So, again, so bear with me here. The point being that where does this inevitably lead to, right? This couples into multiple things. Ireland is essentially under the hammer of mass migration at the minute. And I believe the EU Asylum Pact only makes it worse. We are also under the whims of a lot of what I would call hard left-wing ideologues, right? And they're dealing in ideas like equality of outcome, not equality of opportunity, equality of outcome. And then they introduce intersectionality, right? So they start off by saying there aren't enough women in the Dáil. We want more female candidates. And then they start saying, well, there aren't enough migrants. There aren't enough Muslims. There aren't enough lesbians, or whatever it is. They make it identity based, and we inevitably fall into identity politics here. Now, essentially, again, with the inevitability, if you look at mass immigration and the ideological pursuits we have of equality of outcome, we are literally on a systemic path to push white Irish people out of politics and push anyone but that in. I believe it's don't know if it's the refugee councillor who was someone recently called for the government to facilitate a migrant TD internship scheme. Now, diversity is one thing to call for. You can call for people who are black and Irish or who are born here or whatever. When you call for a migrant internship scheme, you are literally calling for a program that facilitates people from other countries to govern your country. I don't believe that's right. And again, this is not about race, because it's not about people who are born here or people who have citizenship. It's genuinely a migrant internship scheme. I think that is a crazy idea. I think Irish people fought for long enough against foreign influence and foreign rule to make it clear that all we want is a little bit of autonomy, self-determination, and legal individualism, which I believe the EU erodes. They're trying to harmonise everything legally, so we lose our legal individualism. But with regards to literally people who are born in other countries who have no Irish ancestry, I believe it is a subversion of self-determination, and I believe the point is, again, would I have a problem with this? Even let's say 12 of them? No. But the problem is we have a legal door open that through mass immigration and demands for intersectionality and employment quotas, which we're seeing now too, we are on a path where essentially maybe 50, 60 years from now, like essentially people from other countries may be the majority in our Dáil. And at that point then, if you ask any person, like, do you think a bunch of people from India, China, Nigeria, Brazil, America, and France should run Ireland? They would say no. But if you look at the amount of foreign candidates that the mainstream parties are running, we are heading in that direction. So it's not, like I said, it's really not a race-based issue. If anything, it's a I mean, let me put it this way: I don't believe it's xenophobic, but to call it racist is completely incorrect. If you were to call it anything, you should call it xenophobic. But even then, it's not xenophobic because we have Dahi O'Fallon and we have Mandy Gall in our party. Mandy was born in England, Dahi was born in America. So this is not about people from other countries. Both of them have Irish parents, or
Is
rather,
the difference there that they have Irish some lineage and parents or something?
it is absolutely. But again, this is not racial because again, if you do you know who Kevin Sharkey is?
I don't know.
Kevin Sharkey, where he's kind of on loosely what you call. He'd probably be along with yourself. He's quite libertarian, but he's kind of nationalist and right wing too. But he is a mixed race guy. You know, like Paul McGrath, Phil Lynott, like he has, like he's. You certainly wouldn't call him white, but I have nothing against him. He was a member of the Irish Freedom Party for a long time, and if he runs an election, I will support him because he is Irish. Like Paul McGrath, like Jason Sherlock, like Phil Lynott, these people were Irish. About it's not a racial purity thing. It's about the fact that do you have any connection to this land whatsoever? Because if you don't, why are you trying to govern it? You know, if you came from India 15 years ago, why are you trying to govern the Irish? Like, if you really wanted to be involved in politics, is there not enough seats back home in India? You know, if you come here for a better life, you want to be a teacher, an engineer, an architect, we've no problem with any of that. But we do believe that self-determination means self-determination, you know, and it doesn't mean that, like I said, over the next 50 years, we subcontract that out. I'll finish.
And just so this TD guy Mulhudder, apologies if I'm saying his name wrong. Um, if he came to Ireland and was here for whatever 7 years or something and became, he got a citizenship
Yeah.
legitimately and he's running now, do you consider him just as Irish as anyone else?
Well, let me put it this way. I try to remain very objective. He is an Irish national. He is an Irish citizen. But you know, if the guy is from Nigeria, he's a Nigerian. And you know, like the funny thing is, you get a lot of people who come to Ireland who are all too keen to abandon their ancestry. You don't find that with Irish people. You know, you talk to someone who in America who's Irish, they're only too happy to tell you they're Irish. You know, nobody else, like for some reason, people seem to abandon and they refuse to recognize the firm line between an Irish citizen and an Irish person. An Irish citizen is a person who is an Irish national, has full positive rights, etc., but they do not have Irish ancestry. For example, the man in that Photoshop, he has no. I wouldn't say relation. Relation is the wrong word. He doesn't really recognize what Michael Collins means, maybe to me and you know, or what the famine means. You know,
He,
like
he might though. He might. I actually don't know. Do you know this guy's backstory?
well, as far as I know, he's Nigerian. Like I said, there's a lot of people who've come from India, they've come from Nigeria, they've come from Ghana, etc., and they're running in elections now. And again, you know, Kevin Sharkey is not them. Kevin Sharkey
Hmm.
is Irish. Ebun Joseph is not. Ebun Joseph is a woman who came from Nigeria, has two Nigerian parents, doesn't have a drop of Irish ancestry in her. Like, why would I call her Irish? She's an Irish national. She might be an Irish citizen. I'm not even sure if she is. But again, to I mean, I often say this to people, because you know people try to on Twitter, people come up with things that they think is clever and it's not clever at all. And someone said to me recently, it was like, I think, who was he? Was it James Connolly he was talking about? It was an Irish rebel. Anyway, like a well-known Irish rebel from Irish history, right? And he said, well, he was born in Scotland. and he was an Irish rebel. I was like, why are you calling him an Irish rebel if he was born in Scotland? I said, because you too recognize the value of his ancestry. You know he had Irish parents, and that's why you're calling him an Irish rebel. Why aren't you calling him a Scottish rebel? Why is Eamon de Valera an American rebel? Because we know deep down that ancestry means something. We know deep down that let's say I marry an Irish woman and I move to Japan and then I have a kid, that
Mm.
kid isn't a Japanese person. They're a Japanese citizen, a Japanese national, but they're not ethnically Japanese. Do you know what I mean? We're not Japanese people. Like it, it's somewhat comical almost. And again,
Mm.
basically the line being between a nationality and ethnicity. And I don't dispute that. Like I said, this guy may be an Irish national, and that to an extent that means he is Irish, but it doesn't mean he's Irish to the same extent I am, because like I can trace my family line back to people who were involved in the War of Independence, etc. The history of Ireland is my history. The history of Ireland is not the history of Ebun Joseph. You know, that's essentially the way I look at it. Like, and I don't think that's cruel, because most people are quite proud of their ancestry. Like I said, if I moved to America, I wouldn't all of a sudden start calling myself an American. I'd be like, no, I'm Irish. So I think a lot of the people who play this, and I do think it's a game, I think a lot of people who play this game have something to benefit from what they say. And I think some of them are even by NGOs now. I think a lot of them are even fed a script, because you'll see them contradict themselves, like I'm Irish, and then like as a person of Nigerian heritage, and they set up these clubs then like Nigerians in Ireland or whatever. It's like, you told me you were Irish. Like do you know what I mean? You're actually debunking your own point here by showing your ancestral allegiance, essentially. And again, that's the problem as well with politics, is that in identity politics, I do believe white people have been taught to be the least racist, to be honest, right? We aren't tribal. We've embraced individualism to a high extent, I believe, meritocracy and things like that. And we don't actually judge people on race or anything like that. But identity politics and intersectionality drives a movement essentially that says black people should vote for black people in Ireland, because we need more black representation in Ireland because they're underrepresented. So then these people do vote on racial or ethnic or national or hereditary lines, because they're being fed an ideology that's counterintuitive to equality of opportunity, and actually leads them to believe that they are exploited and oppressed, which in truth they aren't. Nobody's well, I mean, in the doll, yes, like you could say black people and Chinese people are underrepresented, but I mean, I don't see a whole lot of Irish representation in the Nigerian parliament or the Chinese government. So there's that too. Like, if you're
I
going to
get you.
tell us, if we're not good enough, then maybe you're not doing it good enough either too. Like,
Okay, that's very interesting. Like, I'm just two things came up when you were saying that. Was
mm,
the first thing was, I kind of look at America, like a lot of Irish people went there, and Kennedy, they they weren't American either. But they came, and they even had little areas of the Chinatown in South Boston was very Irish, and I think a lot of people look at that as quite a positive time and a positive sort of thing. And then that's maybe a minor point, but the second point is that it's kind of if you follow your logic, I could be getting it wrong here, but then Ireland would never change. Like it would always have to be Irish heritage people doing, you know, in the country. It's like, for example, if like a Nigerian person comes and has children, like when, and they've kids, like at what stage do they meet your
yeah.
criteria for,
No,
you know?
that's a good question. And like you said, like with John F. Kennedy and all, these are good questions, because And luckily, I have a kind of a real world example I can work off here, right? Because I say to myself, yeah, Ebun Joseph or this guy in the tweet, like they should not run for election. But I don't have some historical and it's very hard. This is why it's a good question because it's very hard to say where's the line where you qualify. Because the point I'm making here is this, right? The Irish Freedom Party also want a united Ireland. In a united Ireland, I would not tell Protestants or Ulster Scots or anyone that they can't run. You are, they may not be fully ethnically Irish or whatever. They may be pure Ulster Scots. But the point is, you've been in Ireland for so long. You are generationally here to the point where you are committed to this land. You haven't just blown in the last. You're not here, not even a wet week. So, like I said, it's very interesting because I wouldn't try to prevent any of those people entering government. And I wouldn't try to exile or deport anyone. I'm not into like hundreds of years old retroactive measures. But again, it's about dealing what's here now at the moment. And again, like I said, then about the migrant intern TDship. We're not talking about migrants who came here and had a son or a daughter who's now an Irish citizen who arguably has every positive right. I don't know because it's such a nuanced conversation. I don't have time, 3 generations and now you can run for election. Because when you think about this issue, nearly any regulation that you try to think up sounds a little bit insane. It does so you kind of have to get, you've got to really you've got to say that people who are here long enough are entitled to. You're here long enough. You're part of Ireland. You know what I mean. You have full entitlements. You have full positive rights. You can run for office or whatever. But people only here a wet week should not be afforded these things. And one thing I'll throw in here is that the Irish Freedom Party believe we'd be quite limited in giving out citizenship. And of course, citizenship would entitle you to run elections, vote in elections, whatever it may be. Get HAP, get social welfare, full positive rights. But we believe mostly in work visas because, again, if you allow people to immigrate here, you are kind of facilitating brain drain. So we believe you come here, earn your money, go back home, and invest back home. So going forward, this would be less of a complication if we had our way, essentially, you know what I mean? But like I said, at the same time, it's very hard to put a number on where someone qualifies. But like I said, as far as I'm concerned, everybody up north qualifies. In a united Ireland, they're all full citizens, and again, Paul McGrath isn't even an issue because Paul McGrath's Irish. He's not an immigrant, you know what I mean? But children of immigrants and all, we would have to sort that out. We'd have to come across where is a reasonable line. But again, it's quite a double-sided issue because if we don't allow ourselves to be subject to mass immigration, then the idea of migrants voting isn't such a threat to our culture and our self-determination. If we have a small number coming in, we can let them vote. If you're bringing in 80,000 people a year, you're eroding your own democracy. So, unfortunately, I guess the best thing to say is that a lot of these issues don't exist isolated from each other.
It's a numbers issue for you, sort of thing.
Yeah, largely and like I said, what we do in one area will affect how we should act in other areas. And there's ways I'd like to act in certain areas, but we can only do that if we aren't just absolutely no limits whatsoever in other areas. But it is, like I said, it's very much a numbers issue for me because it's just, too much too fast. It's very simply, it will change culture.
I think there's
in 10 years, if we go on, sorry.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of reasonable conversation around, that without getting into racist sort of, or at
Absolutely.
least being, so yeah, I see what you mean and that from that perspective for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, like I said, one more thing that says that, like I said, this is not race-based whatsoever. We are as much against EU freedom of movement as we are against what you call mass immigration. And EU freedom of movement is French people, German people,
Mm.
like they're all white people. And we don't want 80,000 of them to come here every year either, because we simply can't manage it. So, like I said, it's not a race-based issue. As John McGurk put it, actually, um, recently. He was like, it's a mathematical issue. It's a finite resource issue. It's a supply and demand issue. Unfortunately, it's very easy to discredit the argument and just paint it as racism. But, does not, we don't, the Irish Freedom Party does not have one policy that mentions race, and we never will, right? Ireland is a racially neutral legal system, right? For all that people want to say about white privilege, that's not true. Ireland doesn't have one law that mentions race, right? And the Irish Freedom Party will not change that. We are not making racial policy. Every policy we make will apply to every race equally. A points-based system is a points-based system. It doesn't care what color you are. It's about what skills you have and whether we need them or whether you're surplus labor, etc. So it's just too easy. It's very easy for people to just discredit it because they don't have a real argument. They're ideologues and they believe in mass immigration and they won't back down no matter how reasonable your argument is.
Mm. And exactly, well, I completely agree with you there. Like, I think, like, yeah, just calling something a name, a very derogatory name, and dismissing it is not helpful, especially if there's a lot of people who kind of feel that way.
Yeah, it's
Um,
just ad hominem. It's
yeah,
taking the man and not the ball, so to speak.
and they may have like reasonable arguments, not saying they're right, not saying they're wrong, but they could have very reasonable arguments. But that's not how to go about making their point.
Yeah, and it's not a way to invite someone into dialogue either.
No,
You're not going to get the best out of people by slandering them.
100%. It just shuts it
Yeah,
off before it starts. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Um, Listen, Diarmaid, I've taken up a lot of your time. I
All
really,
good, man.
really appreciate it. And I've got so many questions actually. I might we'll see, we'll maybe talk and see if there might another
We
follow up.
could do part two, yeah, maybe, yeah.
Yes, we'll see how the first one goes
No
down.
problem, yeah.
But yeah, no, thanks again, Diarmaid, and I'll give you the final word.
Yeah, no problem at all, man. And just like I said, it's, if I was to throw in a final word, which I'm a little bit unexpected to do, but I'd just say, look, the vast majority of what I pursue is actually quite philosophically sound, and it's actually quite it is largely based around common sense and things that can actually be proven. Like these are when I converse with people and you give people stats and all, like it's quite hard to argue with the truth. Even if it's there's always been uncomfortable truths. I think we've come to that point in history again where we're going to have to confront some of them. You know, and that's all people like me are trying to do. I don't have any agenda. If I wanted to be in politics, you'd have heard from me a long time ago. I'm 38. I'm getting involved now. If I wanted, I could have joined Fianna Fáil when I was 22. Like, I don't, this isn't what I want to do. I feel like not enough people are speaking out, and I decided I'd be one of them.
Yeah, and I respect that you're doing it that way as opposed to like and not doing the acts of violence and any of that sort of
Yeah,
nonsense.
and
Yeah,
yeah, exactly. Starting riots, etc. Like, which is
yeah,
just like I
yeah. I
said, it
think
leads nowhere. You know what I mean? We
exactly.
got nothing. Anyone who took part in that riot, what did they get from it? Nothing.
A
Nothing at
few
all.
new pairs of shoes.
Yeah, yeah, maybe, yeah. But
Um,
yeah, like I said, no problem at all, Adam. And we might do part two. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Have a great night, man.
All
Cheers.
right. Cheers. You too, man. Take care. Right. Bye bye.